Hi, in this video I want to talk about another element that makes up our model's stages of organizations and stages of the self. As you can see, these models are filled with white lines, and these lines are the lines of development. They are like competencies, so you have hundreds and hundreds of different competencies that are developed more or less independently from one another. So a person might be very highly developed in their aesthetic sense, but very lowly developed in their scientific or logic thinking. So you have an artist that's bad at science. And these differences make up the colorful richness that you see out there in the world, because every person has another psychogram, as you will. It has another set of developmental altitudes. Now, what we found out is that these lines follow the rules of the stages of development. So if a line develops to a certain stage, it follows the same rules that guide this stage. So for example, Faith on Amber follows the same rules as the entire stage does. So it has to follow strict rules, for example. Faith on Amber is not just pick and choose, it's something that you have to follow certain rules with. Then you have a source of dictated truth. So you have, for example, a holy scripture, or you have the Pope or some figure that guides this religion, and this person tells you what is absolutely true. So truth is not something that you find in the world when you look for it. Now, when you look at art on Amber, it follows the same rules. So it also has to follow this strict and absolute truth, and you can't just depict anything you want. You have to depict something that is pleasing to whoever tells you what's true. So to make this more tangible to you, take an example from your own life. Take one of the central lines of development, for example, take the value line, so what is important to me, and just think about what is most important in your life. Which aspects of life are the most important? Write that down, and then think about what you might have answered 10 years ago. You're probably gonna find that you will have answered entirely differently, but you still think that what you answered then is important, because these values are still part of you, but they're not as important as those that you have now. So the set of values that you have now incorporate the set of values that you had 10 years ago, but is more than them. And this is because you see more of the world and you have more context of life. And so every line follows this same principle. Now, if you take all of your lines and you mark your development in them, you get something like a psychograph, like an integral psychograph with many different lines, and you see how they stretch out over the spectrum of the stages. Now, when you have a lot of discrepancy between certain lines, this is what causes suffering. Because if you're very highly developed in one line and very lowly developed in another one, you're constantly going to be suffering from that lower line. So for example, you might have very high development in your leadership and in your professional competence and all of that, but very low development in your dealings with money. Now, every time money is an issue in your job, you're going to stumble over that poor development, and this is what causes suffering. Now, on the other hand, if most of your lines are about the same stage, this is what we call healthy or coherent. So it doesn't matter on what stage you are, you can be healthy at any stage if your lines are about the same stage. Now it's time to distinguish between different lines, because some lines are more important than others. Some lines are part of your self-system, so they are part of what you call I. For example, your self-identity, your values, your body, your relationships, all of these parts of you are very important. And if one of these lines is lower developed than others, this is going to cause more suffering. But you have many other lines that are more like competencies. They're like something like plugins. So for example, how good your language skills are. This might be very important depending on what you do. If you lead a life where language doesn't play a big role, it's not as important to you and it doesn't cause as much suffering. Now, these plugin lines, they follow the central lines of the self. So these self lines, they usually pave the way of development and the other lines fill in. Now, one particular line is extremely important because it paves the way to all the other lines, and that is cognition. Cognition is what you can see and what you can perceive and what you can understand. If you can't see or understand something, it's just not part of your world. And so none of the other lines can incorporate this particular element into their development. So cognition always paves the way for every other line. And now there's one more thing that's really interesting. Some lines are individual and some lines are collective. So they develop only when more than one person are around. For example, our relationships or our social structures. And this is where our two different models come into play, because stages of organizations is focusing on people in their business world. So it also focuses on how the organizations develop themselves, how the structures look on a particular stage. Stages of the self, on the other hand, focuses on our individual development and is particularly interesting if you want to focus on your practice and if you want to see where you personally can develop further. So I hope I could give you an overview of what developmental lines are, and I'll see you in the next video when we talk about the quadrants.